Asia News.
On April the 25th, 1915, men of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps landed at Gallipoli. It was on that day the traditions of our fighting forces were born. These stories of their sons and daughters at war we proudly dedicate to the memory of AnZac. Changi, a name which is part of Australia's history. These men are Australian soldiers. These are the men of Changi, of the Death Railway, of the Sandakan Death March. This is their story, a grim story, which is yet an epic of courage and endurance. It is the story of the 8th Division, AIF. In December 1941, there was a temporary lull in Australia's war on land. The New Zealanders were still with the victorious Army of the Nile in Libya. But the 3 Australian divisions in the Middle East, the 6th, 7th, and 9th, were resting and training in Syria and Palestine after their grueling battles in Greece, Crete, Syria, and Tobruk. But while they skylarked in Palestine, war clouds were gathering in the Pacific. To meet the growing Japanese threat, the Australian government had agreed to send the remaining AIF division, the 8th, to reinforce the defences of the great British naval base at Singapore. In February 1941, the first Australians had landed at Singapore. Air Chief Marshal Brooke Popham, the Far East Commander-in-Chief, and other officers welcomed them. They were New South Welshmen of the 22nd Brigade, young soldiers as yet untried in war. With attached troops, they numbered 5,750. From Singapore, the Australians moved up to the jungles of Malaya for training. They had already had 6 months' hard training in camps near Sydney, but it had been for conditions in the Middle East and based on the idea of rapid mechanized movement in open country. Now they had to learn how to move and fight in dense, steamy, malarial jungle, where roads were few or non-existent, and where opportunities for ambush lay everywhere. This was a grim, new kind of warfare which Australians had never faced before. The Tommy gun was the ideal infantry weapon for close jungle fighting. It was not all hard work. There was leave in Singapore. The Chinese open-air theatre was always an attraction, a far cry from King's Cross and the Riverina towns. It wouldn't be the East without its snake charmers. They couldn't know, these carefree young men, as they watched half apprehensively, that before another year had passed, they would be eating snakes to keep from starving. Nor could they know that the time was fast coming when craft like these would represent the one desperate chance of freedom. War seemed far away in this peaceful setting. Easter 1941 saw the cooks cheerfully busy turning out thousands of hot cross buns for the boys. They were happy days of comradeship. AnZac Day, and a ceremonial visit from the Sultan of Selangor. Lieutenant General Gordon Bennett, commander of the 8th Division, welcomed him. Toughened by 2 months in the jungle, the Australians marched proudly past General Bond, General Officer commanding Malaya. Later, he was succeeded by General Purcell. General Bennett laid a wreath on the cenotaph, and a bugler sounded the last post. In August, the 27th Brigade, made up of Queensland, Victorian and New South Wales battalions, joined the 22nd Brigade in Malaya. The 3rd of the 8th Division's brigades, the 23rd, faced an equally grim fate in Timor, in Ambon and in Rabaul. Air Chief Marshal Brooke Popham and Brigadier Maxwell were there to greet the Australians. The AIF were not the only Australian fighting men in Malaya. The Royal Australian Air Force had 4 squadrons there too. Making your bed meant literally what it said in Malaya. These Indian-type beds, called charpoys, were more comfortable than they looked. But the days of such peaceful activities were fast drawing to a close. In December 1941, Japan strikes suddenly and without warning in a great arc from Pearl Harbor to Malaya. At dawn on December 8th, the invasion of Malaya begins. The testing time for the 8th Division is at hand. But the first shock of the Japanese attack falls on the 3rd Indian Corps in northern Malaya. The Australians' task is the defense of Johor and Malacca in the south. They press on urgently with their training and preparations, for the news from the north is bad. Japan's 3-pronged thrust in Malaya is succeeding on all fronts, and the northern defenses are crumbling. Already one of the 3 divisions defending Malaya has virtually ceased to exist. These are still only practice alerts, but everyone now knows it won't be long before they'll be manning the guns in deadly earnest. Nor will it be long before the infantry will have all their skill tested against a fanatical and cunning enemy. It's rough work for the Bren carriers. Senior officers confer while the Australians push on with their preparations to meet the attack that will soon be bursting on them through the jungle and the rubber plantations. A Chinese military mission visits the Australians. Guns and trucks need roads to move on, and there are no roads in the Malayan jungle. So the Australian sappers set to build them. Where there are no roads, rivers have their uses, and the Queensland 26th Battalion take to the water in an unfamiliar naval role. Their job is to patrol the Sedili River Highway and keep a lookout for the enemy. One of the unseen hazards of the jungle is malaria, and every precaution has to be taken against the mosquitoes which carry it. The dusk ritual of the changing of the guard has a new significance now, with the sound of battle coming ever closer from the north. Singapore, with its teeming Asian population, the motto is business as usual. But death is overhead. War has come to Singapore. In the wrecked and burning buildings, hundreds lie dead. Dead, too, is the comfortable myth of an impregnable fortress. This is a grim foretaste of the mounting horrors that lie ahead as the red tide of war floods down the Malayan peninsula. The Allied Air Force hardly survived the first 3 days of fighting. The wreckage of a Zero's victim fascinates Japanese soldiers. Hudson bombers of No. 1 Squadron, RAAF, had struck the first blow at the Japanese invaders from Kota Baru, bombing and machine gunning transports and barges as the enemy swarmed ashore. But there were only 160 Allied aircraft matched against 530 Japanese, and the Allied planes were outclassed. At the end of the first day's fighting, there were only 50 Allied aircraft fit for operations in northern Malaya. Despite the gallantry of the Allied pilots, the Japanese had established complete air superiority. By December 10, all the surviving fighters and most of the bombers had been withdrawn to Singapore. Before the Japanese attacked, Wirraways of No. 21 Squadron, RAAF, had been stationed in Malaya. One of their pilots was Jeff Shepherd of Gordon, Sydney. Disaster at sea followed disaster in the air. The battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse were sunk by aircraft on the third invasion day. The Japanese had landed at Singora and Patani in Thailand and Kota Baru in Malaya. Only 2 roads led south to Singapore. The Japanese advanced 700 miles in 55 days, and the defenders fell back before them. At Gemus, Australians fought their first battle against the Japanese. And here at Muar, no less than 900 gallant Australians lost their lives in battle. Then for 13 days, they made a fighting withdrawal back to the island fortress of Singapore. On January 14, 1942, the New South Welshmen of the 2nd 30th Battalion were the first Australians to meet the Japanese soldier in battle in the Second World War. In a desperate 2-day battle, the Australians, facing odds of 3 to 1, inflicted the first defeat on the Japanese. For a loss of 92 casualties, this battalion killed more than 1,000 Japanese. They fought, said General Yamashita's Chief of Staff, with a bravery we had not previously seen. Gemus was followed by the Battle of Muar, where the 2nd 29th Victorians and the 2nd 19th Riverina men were cut to pieces after an heroic defense. Working against time, they sweated and dug in the steamy jungle heat to prepare defensive positions. But even while they worked, the enemy was bypassing them along jungle tracks, and soon they were surrounded. The Japanese were prepared to live off the land, but the Australians had to carry their rations with them. Japanese cyclists used jungle tracks, but Australian vehicles needed roads. Meanwhile, enemy air raids on Singapore were intensifying. The battle for the mainland of Malaya was ending, and Singapore Island would soon be under attack. Patient, untiring Chinese women toiled at filling sandbags for protection against the bombers. Singapore was designed to resist attack from the sea, but not from the land. A naked island, Mr. Churchill called it. While defenses were feverishly improvised along the coast, the 1 million inhabitants of Singapore City grimly prepared for an ordeal by fire. After the Battle of Muar, the British forces fell back to Singapore. But the Australians had made the enemy pay a heavy price. Near Bakri, 2 guns of the 2nd 4th Anti-Tank Regiment destroyed no less than 12 enemy tanks and their crews. War photographer Frank Bagnall took these graphic pictures. And now the air attacks on Singapore grow heavier as the Japanese prepare to fight their way onto the island. Japanese advance threatens to cut off all water supplies. It's beginning to be asked now how long resistance can be maintained while the civilians of Singapore suffer so terribly. The Japanese fight their way towards the island of Singapore. Houses are sacrificed so that our guns can find their target. Once across the Johor Causeway, the Japanese are expected to develop their final thrust against our right flank. So this is held in depth by British and Indian troops. But the attack develops on our left flank, thinly manned by the Australians. The Japanese fling 2 divisions against the decimated 22nd Brigade. The Australians hold firm, but the Japanese thrust round their flanks. Desperately, the Australians resist. But the end is near. Singapore's 1 million inhabitants have now only sufficient water for 24 hours. There is no hope left. On February 15, 1942, the decision to surrender is taken. Britain has suffered her worst defeat, and Australia her greatest military disaster. Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, takes the British surrender from General Percival. The men of the 8th Division had fought bravely. 1,800 of them had laid down their lives. And now, what lies ahead? On 130,000 men, including 15,000 Australians, the long night of a brutal captivity falls. They were herded into Changi barracks on Singapore Island. At first, the rations weren't too bad, but the time came when the only food they got each day was less than 8 ounces of rice and 4 ounces of vegetables. They became weak and emaciated. Yet Changi wasn't the worst. Thousands of Australians, beaten, tortured, starved, were forced to work on the Burma-Siam Death Railway, and 2,900 died in building it. 1,800 more died in Borneo. It seems an innocent task and an innocuous broom, but inside the broom head is a homemade radio set. Lieutenant R.F. Wright of Hawthorne, Victoria, shows how it was hidden. News bulletins prepared and circulated at the risk of execution were second only to food in importance in the prisoners' lives. These improvised wireless sets were the prisoners' only links with the outside world for more than 3 bitter years of starvation, brutality, and death. The news they brought gave men hope and interest in a life which often seemed not worth clinging to. 3 years ago, they had been tough, fit fighting men. But though their bodies were weakened, their spirit was never broken. The men of the 8th Division showed in captivity qualities of courage, selflessness, and endurance which added a sad, but proud chapter to the story of AnZac. September 12, 1945, the moment for which all had longed. Japan is beaten and humbled. Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten enters the Singapore municipal buildings to take the Japanese surrender. The British flag flies over Singapore again. Senior Japanese officers, led by General Itagaki, march under guard to sign the instrument of surrender. British and Australian troops line the streets, and former prisoners crowd to watch their former captors humbled. The wheel has swung full circle. An Australian, Brigadier J.D. Rogers of Victoria, leads the sullen Japanese delegates into the surrender ceremony. The rising sun has set. This is the end of the Japanese dream of empire. For some 14,000 Australians, it means going home at last. From Changi, from jungle hell camps, from Sumatra, from Japan, they're going home. But for some, liberation comes too late, and their names are sadly added to the long roll of 7,777 Australians who died in captivity. And not men alone. Australian women died too, shot down, bayoneted, starved and brutalized, upholding the selfless tradition of the nursing service. Those who survived need hospital ships and medical care. These are the men of the 8th Division who fought in Malaya, in Timor, in Ambon and Rabaul, who suffered unimaginable hardships in a terrible captivity, and who yet never forgot they were soldiers and Australians. They had been starved. They had been beaten. They had been forced to work until they dropped and were kicked to their feet again. Cholera, malaria, pellagra, beriberi, dysentery, smallpox, tropical ulcers had worn their bodies down, but not their spirits. Many of them owed their lives to doctors and medical orderlies who were their fellow prisoners. And now they were going home. The Amps, they call themselves. Only the toughest and bravest could have lived through what these men did. They had suffered, they had endured, and somehow they had come through. From the beginning to the end, the tradition of mateship eased the way. And now, at last, after the terrible years, their own loved land, their homeland, their Australia. They are welcomed with flooding relief, with affection, with love, and with pride, too. For they had faced with honor a sterner test of manhood than any other Australian soldiers were called on to meet. It's good to be in uniform again. The long wait, the heart-wrenching anxieties are ended now. There's a future to look forward to again. They kept the faith.
Malaysia News.